A freezing Tuesday night. A dark, rain-slicked alleyway in downtown Boston. A young ER nurse discovers a man bleeding to death from a gunshot wound. Against her better judgment, and a loaded gun pointed at her chest, she drags him to her apartment and saves his life on her kitchen table. But when morning breaks, he is gone, leaving behind a stack of $100 bills and a horrifying truth on the morning news. The stranger she rescued wasn't a victim. He was the city's most ruthless mafia boss, and by saving him, she just became his ultimate obsession. The freezing November rain of Boston was unforgiving, slicing through the thin fabric of Clara Jenkins's trench coat like tiny icy blades. It was 2:15 a.m. She had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift in the trauma ward at Massachusetts General Hospital. Her feet throbbed in her worn-out New Balance sneakers, and the lingering scent of clinical antiseptic and stale hospital coffee clung to her skin. All she wanted was the lukewarm radiator of her cramped Beacon Hill studio apartment, a cup of chamomile tea, and oblivion. To shave 5 minutes off her agonizing commute, Clara took a shortcut through a narrow, unlit service alley running parallel to Cambridge Street. It was a notoriously sketchy path, lined with overflowing industrial dumpsters and the rusted fire escapes of pre-war brick buildings. She hugged her canvas tote bag to her chest, keeping her head down, counting her steps. Just 2 more blocks. Then she heard it. A low, wet sound. A sharp intake of breath, followed by a suppressed groan of agony. Clara froze. The rational part of her brain, the part shaped by a lifetime of living in a major city, screamed at her to keep walking. But the nurse in her, the instinct drilled into her bones through years of saving lives, rooted her feet to the cracked asphalt. She turned her head toward the darkest corner of the alley, right behind a large green waste bin. "Hello," she called out, her voice, barely a whisper against the drumming rain. "Is someone there?" Silence. Only the sound of water gurgling down a nearby storm drain. Clara took a hesitant step forward, pulling her iPhone from her pocket and turning on the flashlight. The harsh white beam pierced the darkness, sweeping over wet brick-shattered glass, and finally a pair of expensive, blood-spattered Oxford leather shoes. Her breath hitched. She lowered the light. A man was slumped against the brick wall. He was entirely cloaked in shadows, but the flashlight revealed the devastation of his injuries. His hand was clamped over his abdomen, pressing down on a dark, spreading stain that turned the white fabric of his dress shirt a horrifying crimson. Rain washed over him, diluting the thick pool of blood gathering around his legs. "Oh my God!" Clara gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. The metallic tang of fresh blood hit her nostrils, a smell she was intimately familiar with. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm a nurse. I'm going to call an ambulance." She fumbled with her phone, her thumb shaking, as she went to dial 911. Faster than she could process, a hand shot out from the dark, fingers icy cold, but possessing a terrifying, crushing strength wrapped around her wrist like a steel vise. Clara let out a short shriek of panic. The flashlight clattered to the wet pavement, its beam illuminating the man's face. He had sharp, aristocratic features, a hardened jawline covered in dark, stubble-high cheekbones, and eyes so dark they looked like voids in the night. His skin was deathly pale from blood loss, but the lethal intensity in his glare was unmistakable. "No cops!" he ground out. His voice was a deep, gravelly rasp, heavily laced with a subtle East Coast accent. "No hospitals. You're bleeding to death," Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tried to pull her wrist away, but his grip didn't falter. "You have a perforated abdomen. If I don't call paramedics, you will be dead in less than 20 minutes. I said..." He leaned forward, slightly wincing as the movement tore at his wound. No. With his free hand, he slowly pulled back the lapel of his ruined, bespoke, charcoal suit jacket. Tucked into a shoulder holster was a matte black Glock 19. He didn't point it at her, but the implication was clear enough to make Clara's blood run cold. "You're a nurse," he whispered, his head lolling slightly back against the brick as weakness overtook him. "Fix me." I don't have supplies out here," Clara stammered, panic rising in her throat. She looked around the deserted alley. Nobody was coming. "My apartment is 3 blocks away. Can you walk?" The man didn't answer immediately. His dark eyes locked onto hers, searching her face with an unnerving, predatory focus, even as his life bled out onto the pavement. He was calculating the risk, evaluating her. Finally, he gave a single tight nod. "Help me up," he commanded. It took everything Clara had to get him on his feet. He was easily 6'2" and built like a heavyweight fighter, a solid mass of muscle wrapped in a suit that probably cost more than her annual salary. She slung his heavy arm over her shoulder, wrapping her own arm around his waist, careful to avoid the gunshot wound. The smell of high-end Tom Ford cologne mixed heavily with the copper scent of blood. "What is your name?" she asked breathlessly as they began the agonizing, stumbling walk out of the alley. "Dominic." He rasped, his breathing growing dangerously shallow. "Just Dominic. Just Dominic." The 3 blocks felt like 3 miles. Twice Dominic's knees buckled, and Clara had to brace herself against a parked car to keep them both from collapsing onto the sidewalk. By the time they reached the rusted security door of her apartment building on Phillips Street, Clara was soaked in sweat and rain, her own scrubs stained with his blood. She fumbled with her keys, dragging him into the dim, flickering light of the foyer, and practically carried him up the single flight of stairs to Unit 2B. Clara kicked her apartment door shut, locking the deadbolt out of sheer instinct. "The kitchen," she panted, steering him toward the small laminated island counter in the center of her cramped living space. "Get on the table." Dominic didn't argue. He gritted his teeth, a low, feral sound escaping his chest as he hoisted himself onto the counter, knocking over a stack of unpaid electric bills and a half-empty box of Cheerios. He leaned back on his elbows, his chest heaving, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Clara didn't hesitate. Hospital protocol took over, suppressing her terror. She ran to her bathroom and pulled out her heavy-duty medical trauma kit, a habit she had maintained since nursing school. She grabbed sterile saline, betadine surgical gauze, curved hemostatic forceps, a needle driver, and sutures. When she returned to the kitchen, Dominic had managed to shrug off his ruined jacket. He was wearing an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak watch on his left wrist, a timepiece worth easily $80,000. It was splattered with blood. "I have to cut your shirt," Clara said, stepping between his spread legs to get a clear angle at his abdomen. "Do it," he hissed, his head falling back. She took her trauma shears and sliced through the expensive white cotton, peeling the fabric away from his skin. The wound was low on his right side, just above the hip bone. Clara grabbed a sterile towel and wiped away the excess blood. She let out a small breath of relief. "You're lucky," Clara murmured, her hands moving with rapid, practiced precision. "It's a through and through. The bullet exited cleanly out the back. It missed your liver and your right kidney by about an inch, but the bleeding is severe. I need to pack it and stitch the muscle fascia, then the skin." "Get to work, Florence Nightingale," he muttered darkly. "I don't have general anesthesia, or even heavy local anesthetics," Clara warned him, looking up into his eyes. "I only have a small vial of lidocaine. It's not going to be enough for a deep tissue suture. This is going to hurt like hell." "I've had worse," Dominic said flatly. Clara didn't ask what could possibly be worse than having a gunshot wound sewn shut on a kitchen counter with minimal painkillers. She drew the lidocaine into a syringe and injected it in a ring around the entry and exit wounds. Dominic didn't even flinch. His stoicism was terrifying. Normal men screamed. Normal men passed out. Dominic just stared at the ceiling, his jaw locked so tight the muscles twitched. As she worked, flushing the wound with saline and betadine, the silence in the apartment stretched tight. The only sound was the rain lashing against the single-pane window and the ragged rhythm of Dominic's breathing. Clara picked up the needle driver, threading a curved needle with thick silk suture. "Starting the deep stitches," she warned. As the needle pierced his torn muscle, Dominic sucked in a sharp breath. His left hand suddenly shot out, gripping Clara's hip to brace himself. His large hand was surprisingly warm, his long fingers pressing into her skin through her thin scrubs. Clara froze for a fraction of a second, her heart skipping a beat at the sudden intimate contact, but she forced herself to keep working. "Why didn't you go to a hospital?" Clara asked softly, trying to distract him from the excruciating pain as she tied off the first knot. "Because a hospital means a police report," Dominic replied, his voice strained. "And a police report means a very public record of my current vulnerability. Who shot you?" "Men who are currently dead," he answered coldly. Clara's hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them. She was sewing up a murderer, or a cartel member, or worse. Yet looking at him, she didn't feel the paralyzing fear she knew she should. She just saw a broken human body that needed fixing. "You're very calm for a woman harboring a man with a gun." Dominic noted his dark, heavy-lidded eyes dropping to watch her face. "Most people would be screaming. I work in an ER in downtown Boston," Clara said dryly, tying off the final internal stitch and moving to close the skin. "I've pulled knives out of chests and tackled meth addicts throwing IV poles. You're just another Tuesday night." A low, raspy chuckle vibrated in Dominic's chest, ending in a wince. "You're lying. Your pulse is racing. I can see it fluttering in your neck." Clara blushed, cursing her fair skin. She focused entirely on the needle sewing the neat, precise stitches across his skin. 10 minutes later, she finished taping a thick pressure dressing over the exit and entry wounds. "Done," she exhaled, stepping back and stripping off her bloody latex gloves. "You need broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent sepsis, and you need to not move for at least a week so you don't tear the internal sutures." Dominic slowly sat up, groaning, as his abdominal muscles contracted. He looked down at the neat, professional dressing, then back up at Clara. "You saved my life," he said. It wasn't a thank you. It was a statement of fact delivered with a heavy weight that made the hairs on the back of Clara's neck stand up. "Don't make me regret it," she said quietly. Dominic's gaze lingered on her face, taking in her exhausted green eyes, her messy auburn hair escaping from its claw clip the smudge of blood on her cheek. "I'm going to sleep on your couch," he announced, slowly sliding off the counter. Before Clara could protest, he limped heavily toward her small, faded velvet sofa, collapsed onto it, and was unconscious almost before his head hit the throw pillow. Clara stood in her ruined kitchen, staring at the terrifying, beautiful stranger, bleeding onto her furniture. She noticed his suit jacket on the floor. His cell phone had fallen out of the inner pocket. The screen lit up in the dark, vibrating silently. Clara hesitated, then walked over and picked it up. A text message was displayed on the lock screen. "Sender Mateo. Message: the Colombians breached the harbor warehouse. We found the mole. Waiting on your order, boss." Clara dropped the phone as if it had burned her. "Boss." She retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her, though she knew a hollow core door wouldn't stop a man like him. She sat on the edge of her bed, terrified, exhausted, and wide awake until the sun began to rise. Clara woke with a violent start. Her alarm clock was blaring, flashing 6 a.m. She had fallen asleep, sitting up against her headboard, her hands clutching a can of pepper spray she kept in her nightstand. The events of the previous night came rushing back like a freight train. The rain, the blood, the gun. Dominic. She scrambled off the bed, her heart in her throat, and cautiously unlocked her bedroom door. She cracked it open, peering into the living room. The apartment was dead silent. The velvet couch was empty. Clara walked out slowly. The heavy metallic scent of blood still hung in the air, and a dark stain ruined the upholstery of the sofa. But the man was gone. There was no note, no sign of a struggle. It was as if a ghost had passed through her apartment. But he had left something behind. Sitting on her small kitchen island, right next to a bloodied piece of gauze she had missed during her panicked cleanup, was a neat, thick stack of cash. Clara approached it slowly. They were all crisp, uncirculated $100 bills, bound in a heavy paper bank band. $10,000 at least. Resting on top of the money was a sleek, black burner phone. Clara stared at the money, a sick feeling twisting in her stomach. This wasn't a thank you gift. This was hush money. It was a down payment for her silence. She didn't touch it. She couldn't. Operating on autopilot, she scrubbed the blood off her counter with bleach, showered, changed into fresh, sterile blue scrubs, and walked to the hospital for her morning shift. The rain had stopped, leaving the Boston streets slick and reflecting the grey morning sky. When Clara arrived at Mass Gen, the ER was in absolute chaos. Sirens wailed outside the ambulance bays, and nurses were sprinting down the halls with crash carts. "What happened?" Clara asked her charge nurse, a seasoned woman named Brenda, as she signed in at the front desk. "Mob war," Brenda said, grimly, not looking up from her charts. "Total bloodbath down in the North End around midnight. Gunfight at a private social club. 3 dead on the scene, 5 more brought in with critical GSWs. Cops are swarming the place." Clara's blood ran cold. Midnight, just hours before she found Dominic. She walked slowly toward the staff break room to put her lunch in the fridge. The small television in the corner of the room was tuned to the local Boston news network. Police are still piecing together the timeline of the brutal shootout at the Salici Club, the anchor was saying. Sources inside the BPD confirmed that the attack was an attempted assassination on Dominic Rousseau, the elusive and ruthless head of the Russo crime syndicate, which controls the majority of illicit trade on the eastern seaboard. Rousseau's current whereabouts are unknown. Authorities believe he may have been critically wounded during the ambush. A photograph flashed on the screen. It was a surveillance, still slightly grainy but unmistakable. Sharp jawline, dark, soulless eyes. The same bespoke charcoal suit, though unblooded in the photo. Clara dropped her thermos. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crack, spilling black coffee everywhere. Dominic Rousseau. She hadn't just saved a criminal. She had saved the king of the Boston Underworld. A man responsible for extortion, racketeering, and murder. A man the FBI had been trying to nail for a decade. "Jenkins, you good?" a passing doctor asked, looking at the spilled coffee. "Fine," Clara choked out. "Just clumsy." The rest of the shift was a blur of anxiety. Every time the ER doors slid open, Clara expected to see a team of FBI agents coming to arrest her for aiding and abetting a fugitive, or worse, a team of mob hitmen coming to tie up loose ends. Why had he left her alive? Men like Dominic Rousseau didn't leave witnesses. He knew where she lived. He had been inside her home. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, Clara was a vibrating bundle of nerves. She clocked out practically running to the staff parking garage. The underground structure was dimly lit and eerily quiet, echoing with the sound of her rapid footsteps. She reached her ancient Honda Civic, fishing her keys out of her tote bag with trembling fingers. "You shouldn't walk to your car alone, Clara." The voice came from the shadows behind a concrete pillar, deep, gravelly, familiar. Clara whipped around her heart, stopping. Stepping out of the darkness was a man, but it wasn't Dominic. It was a towering, broad-shouldered enforcer in a tailored black suit. He had a jagged scar running down the left side of his face and cold, dead eyes. "Who are you?" Clara backed up against her car door, her hand gripping the pepper spray in her pocket. "How do you know my name?" "My name is Matteo," the man said, smoothly stopping 6 feet away, keeping his hands visible in a placating gesture. "My boss sent me. He prefers it when people he values aren't left unguarded." "I don't need a guard," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I don't know anything. I took the money. Tell him we're even. I'll never speak of this." Matteo tilted his head, a terrifying, emotionless smile touching his lips. "You misunderstand, Miss Jenkins. The money wasn't to buy your silence. The money was for your services. Mr. Russo has decided he requires a private physician. I'm an ER nurse, not a private doctor." Clara snapped, fear giving way to a sudden desperate anger. "I'm not working for the mob. Tell him no." Matteo stepped closer, invading her personal space. The sheer size of him blocked out the dim fluorescent lights of the garage. "You really don't understand the situation you're in, Clara," Matteo said softly. "Dominic Russo doesn't ask. You saved his life. In his eyes, that makes you his property now. And right now he is bleeding through your stitches. So you are going to get in the black SUV parked on the next level, and you are going to come fix him again." "And if I refuse?" Clara challenged, her chin lifting defiantly. Matteo sighed, reaching into his jacket. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a glossy 8x10 photograph and held it up. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of her younger sister Lily, walking across the campus of Boston University, laughing with a friend. "We know everything, Clara," Matteo said, his voice devoid of malice, just stating a cold, hard fact. "We know about Lily's tuition you're struggling to pay. We know about your mother's medical debt. We can make all of those problems disappear overnight. Or we can make your sister disappear tonight." Clara stared at the photo, the fight draining out of her body, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. She had thought she was saving a life in that alley. Instead, she had just sold her soul to the devil. "Lead the way," she whispered. The ride in the back of the tinted Cadillac Escalade was suffocatingly silent. Rain had begun to fall again, streaking across the heavy bulletproof glass and blurring the glowing street lights of Boston into smeared streaks of yellow and red. Clara sat rigidly in the plush leather seat, her nursing scrubs feeling paper-thin against the aggressive chill of the SUV's climate control. Matteo sat in the passenger seat, his massive frame perfectly still, a silent sentinel monitoring the perimeter. The driver, a young man with a freshly broken nose and knuckles wrapped in white athletic tape, navigated the slick roads with a terrifying, aggressive precision. They took the Massachusetts Turnpike west, leaving the dense urban sprawl behind, eventually exiting onto the winding, tree-lined roads of Weston. It was one of the wealthiest and most secluded suburbs in the state, a place where old money hid behind iron gates and acres of dense forest. Clara's mind raced, cycling through 100 different worst-case scenarios. She thought of Lily safe in her Boston University dormitory on Commonwealth Avenue, completely oblivious to the fact that a Mafia enforcer had just used her life as a bargaining chip. Clara swallowed hard, tasting the bitter ash of terror in the back of her throat. She had spent her entire adult life playing by the rules, working double shifts to pay off their late mother's crushing oncology bills, fighting tooth and nail to keep her sister out of debt. Now, in the span of 24 hours, she had been dragged into a violent underworld she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The SUV slowed, turning down a private, unmarked asphalt road, surrounded by towering, centuries-old pine trees. At the end of the half-mile drive stood a massive wrought-iron gate flanked by stone pillars and heavily armed guards holding suppressed automatic rifles. Matteo rolled down his window, gave a sharp nod, and the gates swung open with a heavy metallic groan. They pulled up to a sprawling modern architectural marvel, a fortress disguised as a luxury estate. It was all sharp angles, dark slate, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows that were undoubtedly ballistic-grade glass. "Out," Matteo ordered quietly as the SUV came to a halt under the grand portico. Clara climbed out her worn sneakers, hitting the pristine cobblestone driveway. She was immediately flanked by two more men in dark suits. They escorted her through towering mahogany double doors into a foyer that looked like a modern art museum. Abstract paintings hung on raw concrete walls, and a massive crystal chandelier hung suspended over a sweeping glass staircase. But Clara barely registered the exorbitant wealth. The air in the house was thick with tension, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke, espresso, and copper. "Upstairs," Matteo instructed, leading the way. He refused to go to the underground medical bay. "He's in his quarters." They climbed the glass stairs and walked down a long, dimly lit corridor. At the end of the hall, heavily carved oak doors stood slightly ajar. Matteo pushed them open, gesturing for Clara to enter. The master bedroom was cavernous, dominated by a king-sized bed with dark silk sheets. The room was cast in heavy shadows, illuminated only by the glow of a stone fireplace and the muted lights of the city skyline, visible through the distant windows. Dominic Russo was sitting on the edge of the bed, bathed in the flickering firelight. He had stripped off his shirt, his broad, heavily tattooed chest heaving with every ragged breath. A fresh white bandage was wrapped around his midsection, but it was already soaked through a dark, terrifying crimson stain, spreading rapidly across the gauze. His skin, naturally olive-toned, was pale and coated in a sheen of cold sweat. A glass of amber liquid, likely bourbon, shook violently in his grip before he set it down on the nightstand with a sharp clatter. Clara's medical instincts overrode her fear. She rushed forward, dropping her tote bag onto the floor. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative, entirely forgetting that she was speaking to a mob boss who had essentially kidnapped her. "I told you not to move for a week." Dominic looked up at her, his dark eyes slightly glazed with fever, but the lethal sharpness underneath remained completely intact. A ghost of a smirk played on his pale lips. "I had a business meeting, Florence Nightingale. People tend to think you're weak if you conduct negotiations lying on your back." "You tore the internal sutures," Clara snapped, snapping on a fresh pair of latex gloves from her bag. "Lie back. Now, or I swear to God you will bleed out right here on your ridiculous silk sheets." Dominic's jaw tightened, but he complied, wincing in agony as he leaned back against the pillows. "You have a sharp tongue," for a woman was just forcefully brought to an undisclosed location. "You threatened my sister," Clara said, her voice shaking with a sudden venomous rage as she grabbed her trauma shears and began cutting away the ruined bandage. "You sent your thug to terrify me, so forgive me if my bedside manner is lacking. I am only here because you held a gun to my family's head." Dominic's hand shot out his grip, entirely different from the alleyway, weaker, yet somehow more commanding. His long fingers wrapped around her wrist, stopping her movements. He looked directly into her eyes, the fever burning hotly in his gaze. "I didn't hold a gun to your family's head, Clara," he said, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "I showed you exactly what would happen if my enemies found out who stitched me up. The Colombians are hunting me. If they know you saved my life, they won't just kill you. They will take your sister Lily, and they will make you watch what they do to her before they put a bullet in her brain. Mateo wasn't threatening you. He was showing you the reality of the game you entered the second you picked me up off that pavement." Clara froze, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp rush. She stared at him, trying to find the lie in his dark, unreadable eyes. She found none. "You're here because this fortress is the only place in Massachusetts where you and your sister are currently safe." Dominic continued, finally releasing her wrist. "Mateo already moved Lily from her dorm to a secure penthouse under a fake name. She thinks she won a luxury academic retreat. She is guarded by 4 of my best men." Clara staggered back half a step, her mind spinning. You moved her. I protect what is mine." Dominic stated, his voice flat and absolute. "And right now, your hands are the only thing keeping me alive. That makes you mine to protect. Now fix the damn stitches." Tears of pure, unadulterated frustration pricked Clara's eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. She turned her attention back to the wound. He was right. The deep muscle fascia sutures had torn completely under the strain of whatever violent business he had been conducting. For the next hour, Clara worked in agonizing silence. She had to administer a heavy dose of local anesthetic, clean the infected tissue, and resuture the torn muscle layers. She set up an IV drip using supplies Mateo brought up from their private stock, pumping high-dose ceftriaxone directly into Dominic's bloodstream to combat the rising fever. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. She taped the final pressure dressing in place and stepped back, wiping her brow with the back of her forearm. Dominic had finally succumbed to exhaustion and the painkillers falling into a deep, restless sleep. Mateo appeared silently in the doorway. "There is a guest suite prepared for you down the hall, Miss Jenkins. Clothes in your size have been provided. Do not attempt to leave the compound. The perimeter guards have orders to shoot unrecognized figures moving in the dark." Clara looked at the sleeping monster in the bed, then at the enforcer. She had no choice. She was trapped in a gilded cage, 3 days blurred into an agonizing, surreal routine. Clara was given the run of the massive Western estate, though she was never allowed near the front doors or the communications room. The guest suite she was assigned was larger than her entire apartment building, stocked with designer clothes that fit her perfectly a detail that sent a fresh wave of chills down her spine. Her days consisted of checking Dominic's vitals, changing his dressings, and managing his IV antibiotics. To her immense frustration, Dominic was a terrible patient. He refused to stay entirely bedridden. By the second day, he was sitting up at his heavy oak desk in the corner of his bedroom, reviewing shipping manifests, running illicit operations, and barking orders into a burner phone while Clara forcefully changed his IV bags. Yet in the quiet moments between the chaos of his criminal empire, a strange, terrifying dynamic began to form between them. On the evening of the 3rd day, Clara was sitting in a leather armchair near the fireplace, in his room, reading a medical journal she had found in the library, waiting for his antibiotic drip to finish. Dominic was staring out the reinforced window at the dark tree line, nursing a glass of sparkling water. "You haven't asked me who I killed," Dominic said, suddenly breaking the hour-long silence. Clara didn't look up from her journal. "I don't want to know. The less I know about your business, the better my chances of surviving it." Dominic turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto her. The fever had finally broken, leaving his gaze clear, sharp, and overwhelmingly intense. Hector Ruiz, the head of the Colombian faction running fentanyl through the Boston seaport. He decided to expand his territory into my neighborhoods. He started selling to kids near the high schools in Southie. I warned him twice. He didn't listen. Clara finally closed the journal, looking at him. "So you murdered him." "I executed him," Dominic corrected coldly. "There is a difference. I run gambling, extortion, and weapons. I don't touch the poison. It ruins the city. It ruins the people. I told Ruiz to keep his poison out of my city. He pushed back, so I removed him from the board." "Are you trying to convince me that you have a moral compass?" Clara asked, her tone laced with bitter sarcasm. "Because you're still a criminal, Dominic. You still threaten innocent people. You still shoot people." Dominic slowly walked toward her, his movements stiff but predatory. He stopped just inches from her chair, towering over her. "I am a monster, Clara. I have never claimed otherwise. But I am the monster that keeps worse things out of the dark. And right now, Hector Ruiz's brothers are tearing Boston apart, looking for my head. That is why you are here." Before Clara could retort, the lights in the master bedroom flickered violently. Then everything went pitch black. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the estate for exactly 3 seconds. Boom! An explosion rattled the very foundations of the mansion, shaking the floorboards beneath Clara's feet and rattling the crystal glasses on the wet bar. The blast was so powerful, it blew the heavy oak doors of the bedroom wide open, sending a cloud of pulverized drywall and smoke billowing into the room. The emergency backup generators kicked in, bathing the room in a harsh, flashing red strobe light. An alarm began to shriek, a deafening, piercing wail that made Clara cover her ears. "Get down!" Dominic roared, moving with terrifying speed, despite his injuries. He lunged across the space between them, tackling Clara out of the armchair, just as a hail of heavy-caliber bullets shattered the supposedly bulletproof glass of the massive window. The sound was apocalyptic. The glass held for a fraction of a second before giving way, exploding inward in a shower of deadly crystalline shrapnel. The leather armchair where Clara had been sitting just a heartbeat ago was torn to absolute shreds, stuffing and leather flying into the air as automatic fire chewed through the room. Dominic covered her body entirely with his own, pressing her flat against the thick, imported Persian rug. The sheer weight of him crushed the breath from her lungs. She could feel his heart hammering against her spine, matching the frantic, terrified rhythm of her own. They breached the perimeter. Dominic grunted, reaching to his waist and pulling a heavy silver Desert Eagle from the waistband of his sweatpants. "The Colombians! How?" Clara screamed over the deafening roar of the alarm and the continued gunfire tearing apart the ceiling above them. "You said this place was a fortress. Someone inside sold the security codes." He snarled, his eyes scanning the destroyed room in the red emergency light. "I'm going to skin whoever it is alive. We need to move, now!" He grabbed Clara by the collar of her silk blouse, hauling her to her feet. "Stay behind me. Keep your head down. If I tell you to run, you do not look back. You run until your lungs bleed. Do you understand me?" Clara could only nod her entire body, shaking uncontrollably. The clinical detachment that saved her in the hospital was completely gone, replaced by raw primal panic. Dominic gripped her wrist and dragged her out of the bedroom into the smoky, strobe-lit hallway. The once pristine corridor was a war zone. 2 of Dominic's guards were lying motionless on the floor, surrounded by a rapidly expanding pool of blood. The smell of cordite and burned flesh was nauseatingly thick in the air. From the bottom of the grand glass staircase, harsh voices echoed over the gunfire, shouting rapidly in Spanish. Heavy combat boots pounded against the hardwood floors below. They were swarming the lower level. "Matteo!" Dominic shouted down the hall. Matteo emerged from the shadows near the east wing, his face smeared with soot, holding an M4 carbine rifle. 10 men, boss. Heavily armed. They blew the backup generator room. The front gate is compromised." "The panic room?" Dominic asked, pushing Clara behind the solid concrete pillar of the hallway. "Blocked. They have men pinned in the library corridor." Matteo fired a short burst down the stairs, ducking back as return fire chipped away the concrete inches from his head. "We have to take the maintenance tunnels under the wine cellar." "Cover us," Dominic ordered. He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed Clara and sprinted down the opposite end of the hallway, heading for the service stairs. Clara stumbled her bare feet, slipping on the polished wood, but Dominic's grip was ironclad, practically carrying her. They reached the heavy steel door of the service stairwell. Dominic kicked it open, pushing Clara inside. It was pitch black, smelling of damp concrete and ozone. "Down the stairs," he commanded, his voice tight with pain. Clara realized with a spike of horror that he had been running at full speed with fresh internal stitches. She looked at his side. The white shirt he wore was already staining dark red again. "You're bleeding," she gasped, freezing on the landing. "Keep moving," he barked, shoving her gently but firmly down the concrete steps. They descended 3 flights into the freezing subterranean depths of the mansion. The gunfire above became a muffled, distant thumping sound. They burst into the massive, climate-controlled wine cellar, rows upon rows of vintage Bordeaux and Pinot Noir, stretched into the darkness. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the far wall of the cellar. A man in tactical gear holding a suppressed submachine gun stepped into the aisle. He raised the weapon, the laser sight catching Clara right in the center of her chest. Clara couldn't breathe. She couldn't scream. Time seemed to slow to a terrifying crawl. Dominic didn't hesitate. He stepped squarely in front of Clara, shielding her completely. He raised his Desert Eagle and fired twice. The massive gun roared in the confined space, deafening Clara instantly. The tactical operative was thrown backward, crashing through a wooden rack of expensive wine glass, shattering in a chaotic explosion of red liquid that looked horrifyingly like blood. Dominic let out a sharp, agonized groan, dropping to one knee. He clutched his side, the gun slipping from his fingers to clatter onto the stone floor. "Dominic!" Clara screamed, her temporary deafness breaking. She dropped to the floor beside him. He was violently pale, his breathing rapid and shallow. The physical exertion and the force of firing the heavy weapon had completely ruptured her surgical work. He was bleeding out again, and this time they were trapped in the dark. He looked at her, his vision blurring, but a strange, terrifyingly soft expression crossed his hardened features. "I told you. I protect what's mine." He collapsed onto the cold stone floor, unconscious. Clara was left alone, in the dark, surrounded by shattered glass, a dead assassin and the bleeding king of the Boston Mafia, with the sound of heavy boots echoing down the stairwell above them. The heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed down the concrete stairwell, vibrating against the stone floor of the wine cellar. Clara knelt in the freezing darkness, her hands slick with Dominic's blood, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. The undisputed king of the Boston Underworld was bleeding out on the cold stone, his chest barely rising. Above them, the chaos of the assault raged on. But down here, the immediate threat was the squad of Colombian cartel assassins descending to finish the job. "Dominic," Clara whispered frantically, shaking his broad shoulder. "Dominic, wake up. Please." He didn't move. The catastrophic tear in his abdomen was hemorrhaging rapidly. Without immediate pressure and surgical intervention, he had less than 10 minutes. Flashlight beams cut through the gloom, sweeping across the rows of vintage wine. They were at the bottom of the stairs. Spanish curses echoed in the cavernous room as they discovered the body of the tactical operative Dominic had just killed. "Find them, he's bleeding, he couldn't have gone far," a harsh voice barked. Clara's medical training, usually a beacon of calm, was warring with sheer animal panic. She couldn't drag him. He was a solid mass of dead weight, far too heavy for her to move into the maintenance tunnels alone. If she ran, she might survive. She could disappear into the dark, find a way out, and go to the police. She owed this criminal nothing. He had kidnapped her, threatened her sister, and dragged her into a war zone. But as she looked at his pale face in the dim emergency lighting, she remembered the terrifying, absolute conviction in his voice, just before he took a bullet meant for her. "I protect what's mine." Clara made her choice. She wasn't leaving him. She ripped the silk blouse from her own body, leaving her shivering in a thin cotton camisole, and balled the expensive fabric into a tight, dense knot. She pressed it brutally hard against Dominic's open wound. He let out a weak, unconscious groan, his body twitching from the pain. She leaned her entire body weight onto her hands, using the leverage to staunch the arterial flow. The footsteps grew louder. The flashlights were moving down the center aisle, sweeping over the shattered glass and pooling red wine. Clara's eyes darted to the stone floor. Less than 2 feet away lay the silver desert eagle Dominic had dropped. It looked impossibly large, a weapon designed for destruction, not preservation. She kept her left hand pressed fiercely against Dominic's abdomen, reached out with her right hand and grabbed the gun. The metal was freezing. It was heavier than she ever could have imagined, the grip still warm from Dominic's hand. She had never fired a gun in her life. She was a healer. Her hands were trained to stitch, to mend, to save. But sometimes a dark voice whispered in her mind, "To save one life, you have to take another." She raised the heavy barrel, resting it on the edge of a massive oak wine cask to steady her violently trembling arm. She aimed it down the aisle. A tactical operative stepped into her line of sight. He moved methodically, his rifle raised, a flashlight mounted to the barrel, cutting through the darkness. The beam swept over the floor, catching the trail of Dominic's blood. The light followed the crimson path, stopping exactly where Clara and Dominic lay, huddled in the shadows. "Here!" the operative shouted, raising his rifle. Clara didn't think. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil was apocalyptic. The Desert Eagle roared with a deafening concussion that shook the dust from the ceiling, kicking back with such vicious force it nearly snapped her wrist. But at a distance of 20 feet, the heavy caliber round found its mark. The operative was thrown backward, violently. His chest armor shattered, his rifle clattering uselessly to the floor. "Over there! Fire!" Another voice screamed. Bullets shredded the oak casks above Clara's head. Splinters of wood and a deluge of expensive red wine rained down on her. She ducked low, covering Dominic's body with her own, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the burning impact of a bullet. Suddenly, the deafening chatter of a fully automatic M4 carbine erupted from the far end of the cellar. The incoming fire instantly ceased, replaced by the thud of bodies hitting the stone floor. Silence crashed back into the room, broken only by the drip of wine and blood. "Boss!" Matteo's voice boomed through the cellar. "Clara! Here!" Clara screamed, her voice cracking. "We're here. He's dying." Matteo materialized from the smoke. His suit ruined his face, covered in grime. He took one look at Dominic's pale, lifeless form and the massive pool of blood. Without a word, the giant enforcer scooped the mafia boss into his arms as if he weighed nothing. "The tunnel is clear. The surviving Colombians are retreating," Matteo stated grimly. "We are going to the secondary safe house in the city. The underground clinic is prepped." Clara scrambled to her feet, her hands still coated in blood, her ears ringing from the gunfire. She grabbed the Desert Eagle, slipping it into the waistband of her ruined pants, an unconscious shift in her reality. She was no longer just an ER nurse. She was a survivor in Dominic Russo's world. Inunseal District Safe House was sterile, bright, and equipped better than most trauma centers in Boston. For the next 8 hours, Clara worked alongside a disgraced struck-off surgeon Matteo had brought in on retainer. Together they opened Dominic up, repaired the torn fascia, cauterized the bleeding vessels, and pumped him full of O-negative blood. It was the hardest fight of Clara's life. 3 times his heart stopped. 3 times she brought him back, her hands performing brutal chest compressions, refusing to let the monitor flatline. When it was finally over, she collapsed into a plastic chair in the corner of the room, staring at the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. He was hooked up to a ventilator, pale as a ghost, but alive. 3 weeks passed. The war in the city raged on, but the Russo Syndicate struck back with terrifying coordinated brutality. Without their leader, the Colombian faction was systematically dismantled. Matteo ran the streets with an iron fist, acting on the whispered orders Dominic gave from his hospital bed. Clara never left his side. She managed his recovery, oversaw his physical therapy, and slowly weaned him off the heavy narcotics. The dynamic between them shifted from captor and captive to something deeply complex, unspoken, and fiercely intimate. They spent hours in the quiet solitude of the safe house penthouse. He taught her how to strip and clean a Glock. She taught him how to read his own EKG charts. They played a dangerous game of chess, both on the board and in their conversations. On a cold Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after she had pulled him from that alleyway on Cambridge Street, Dominic stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse overlooking the Boston harbor. He was dressed in a tailored black suit, leaning slightly on a silver-handled cane, looking every bit the ruthless king he was. Clara was sitting at the marble kitchen island, drinking coffee. She wore a black silk robe he had bought her, her auburn hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Dominic turned to face her. He walked slowly to the island and placed a thick manila envelope on the marble surface, sliding it toward her. "What is this?" Clara asked, setting down her mug. "Your life," Dominic said, his voice gravelly, lacking its usual commanding edge. "There are 2 passports in there. One for you, one for Lily. Clean names, flawless backgrounds. There is a secure bank account routed through the Caymans with $10 million and 2 first-class tickets to Geneva departing tonight at 8. Clara stared at the envelope, her heart suddenly pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't touch it. "The Colombians are eradicated." Dominic continued, his dark eyes fixed on her face, searching for a reaction. "The mole in my organization was dealt with. The threat to you and your sister is completely gone. I made a promise to protect what is mine. Now I am releasing you. You saved my life, Clara. Twice I am paying my debt." He was letting her go. She was free. She could take Lily, leave Boston, and live a life of absolute luxury and safety in Europe. It was everything she had ever dreamed of when she was working double shifts at the hospital just to keep the heat on. Slowly, Clara reached out and opened the envelope. She pulled out the crisp blue passports, the banking details, and the glossy boarding passes. She stared at the name printed on the ticket. Sarah Reynolds. A stranger. She looked up at Dominic. The Ruthless Mafia boss was standing rigidly, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle fluttered. For the first time since she had met him, he looked vulnerable. He was bracing himself for her to leave. He expected her to run from the monster. Clara stood up from the stool. She picked up the boarding passes. She walked over to the gas stove, turned the dial until the blue flame roared to life, and held the first-class tickets to the fire. Dominic's eyes widened in shock, as the paper caught the orange flames devouring the flight details. Clara dropped the burning ash into the stainless steel sink, turning on the faucet to wash the remnants down the drain. She walked back to Dominic, stopping inches away from him. She reached up her fingers, lightly tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the dark stubble against her skin. "I stopped being Clara Jenkins the night I picked up that desert eagle in your wine cellar," she said softly, her green eyes locking onto his dark voids. "I don't want to be Sarah Reynolds in Geneva. I don't want a quiet, safe life. I tasted your world, Dominic. I survived it. And God help me, I don't want to leave it." Dominic stared at her, his breathing turning ragged. "You don't know what you are saying. If you stay by my side, in the blood, in the violence. You become the queen of a poisoned city. There is no going back. I will never let you go again." "I'm not asking you to," Clara whispered fiercely. She closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was explosive, a collision of adrenaline relief and dark, consuming passion. Dominic dropped his cane, his large hands wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He tasted like espresso and danger. Clara tangled her hands in his dark hair, kissing him back with a ferocity that matched his own. The city of Boston sprawled beneath them, oblivious to the fact that the ruthless mafia boss hadn't just survived. He had found his equal, and the nurse who had saved a bleeding man in an alley was dead. In her place stood the new queen of the underworld, forged in fire and bound in blood. And that is the thrilling conclusion of our story. What started as a chance encounter in a dark Boston alleyway transformed into an epic tale of survival loyalty and a dangerous romance that shook the underworld. Did Clara make the right choice by burning those plane tickets? Or should she have taken the money and run to Switzerland? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this intense mafia romance drama, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping, heart-pounding stories every single week.